Welcome to DIYEasyCrafts.com. On this video, we're going to take a look at making Dovetail Bolsters. This particular knife project is a nautical themed chef knife. This was etched with car battery charger and electrolyte solution, but this video is going to focus on the bolsters. I wanted to give the bolsters just a little bit more flair and decided to try out Dovetail Bolsters. Now, I'm not claiming to be an expert at this. In fact, this is my very first attempt, but I think I pulled it off pretty well. So this video is really just showing you how I did the Dovetail Bolsters. I started out with a 1/4 inch by 1 inch brass stock. Basically the same material I start with all my bolsters. I pre-drilled the holes to match the holes that are already through the blank. And then I have a 12-inch disc sander. This has got a 220 grit paper on it. I'm going to grind 45. I set the work table at a 45-degree angle, and I'm just going to carefully grind the back surface of each bolster to that 45-degree angle. And I just want to make sure I don't go beyond the very edge, the very top edge. So I'm just going slow, taking my time, holding it flat against the work table. The disc grinders are supposed to be a little bit better for this because the paper mounts directly to the disc, so it's nice and flat. So these are the two bolsters that have the 45s ground in them. You could also do the 45s on a 2x72, but people tell me that because the paper runs over the flat platen, you might not get as flat a grind. You know, bottom line, if you have a disc grinder, use the disc grinder. I'm doing the exact same thing for the scale material. Now this is walnut. We cut it up just a little bit oversized. We went to 3/8 thickness, so that the wood is going to be a little bit thicker than the bricks, and I'll grind that down. After both are ground to the 45, I'm just taking a real careful look at it, make sure that that edge is going to sit perfectly flat, the two pieces together. And then I pin them to the knife, not permanently, just temporarily. And I'm going to use a angle grinder with a flap sanding wheel. I think this has a 36 grit wheel on it. And I'm just going to remove the bulk of the material from the top and the bottom of the bolster. I'm not bringing the profile right into the profile of the blade. I'm just doing the rough work. It just saves me a little bit of time on the 2x72. Now I usually use 1/8 pins on the bolsters. On this particular blade, I forgot to remount the pinholes on the actual blade, and therefore, after it was hardened, that's almost impossible. I had to go with a little bit of a smaller size on the pins. I put the bolsters, again, I pin them together for location, and then put them back into a vise, and I'm going to use that same flap sanding wheel to get rid of the majority of the material on the front end of the bolsters. And I'm going to just start to shape that. I'm actually going to finish the shaping on the 2x72, but again, I'm just removing the bulk of the material, and the flap sanding wheel does a very quick job at this. So most of the bolster is going to get formed after it's attached to the knife, but the front edge we don't have access to after it's attached. So you want to shape and finish that front edge prior to gluing and pinning the bolsters to the blade. So I usually, start with an 80 and go to a 120, and eventually a 400 grit paper. This is a 10-inch large contact wheel on my OBM 2x72 grinder. And the 10-inch wheel makes a nice radius for bolsters, but you could use any wheel you want. Or you don't have to have a curved front edge. You could have a squared off or pointed front edge, however you want to do it. the way I do it is I bring it down to at least like a 400 grit, and then I'll run over to the buffing wheel and just buff that front edge. So now the bolsters are once again placed on the blade just for placement. The front edge is polished on the buffing wheel, and it's basically ready to get glued up. Test fit a couple of times just to make sure. Really don't want to glue anything or permanently put anything in position if everything doesn't fit. I use a 2-part epoxy. It's a 2-ton 24-hour cure. I know a lot of people tape their blades and they keep the epoxy off the blade. I'm really not all that careful with it. I just do a cleanup afterwards. And what I do is I just clean up any of the epoxy that gets onto the blade with alcohol and a paper towel. So I'm going to epoxy both sides of the bolsters into position, with that 2-part epoxy. I forgot to mention the bolster holes themselves have been reamed, and with a tapered reamer. It's not, everybody doesn't do that, but it certainly works nicely when you hammer peen the pins. It gives a real nice mechanical bond. So the pinholes are large on the outside surface and taper in towards the blade. So this way, when you hammer peen the pins and that malleable brass from the pins swells up, it completely fills the void of that taper. And if you do it correctly, after you grind the pins down, you won't even be able to see where the pins were on the bolsters. So I do it while the glue is still wet. It doesn't really matter. However you want to get it done. Sometimes when you're hammer peening the bolsters, you do have to put it back in the vise and squeeze them together and then hammer peen them. Once the hammer peening is done on the pins, clean up any residual epoxy that's on the blade, and especially any that's in that dovetail, in that 45-degree angle. Otherwise, the scale material is not going to sit all the way flush against the bolster. Now the handles, we use the North Guard method. I glue one half of the scales on, I let it dry, and then I use the pre-drilled holes through the blade as a guide for drilling the pinholes through that first half. Then I glue the second half of the scales into position. So again, the same 2-part epoxy. I cleaned off the tang of the blade with alcohol prior to this. I also scuffed it up with some coarse sandpaper so that that glue sticks. I put just a little bit of tension on the clamp, and then I'm going to force that scale forward so there's a nice tight fit between the wood and the brass. Put another clamp on the butt end, and I take a real good look over the blade, make sure that there's no epoxy anywhere on the blade. If there is, I just simply wipe it off with an alcohol. And then I set that aside to dry. After it's dry, I'm going to repeat the drilling process. I go back to the drill press and I use the pre-existing holes in the first half of the scales. Very carefully line those up. And notice that I have a stop on the drill, that big clamp, so the blade can't spin on me if that bit gets bound. But doing it this way allows you to really focus on gluing and getting each half of the scales nice and tight, exactly where you want them, prior to drilling the pinholes. And then the final hole is right through all 3 pieces. So it's nice and squared up and true, and you usually don't end up with any little gaps in the pinholes. I'll then go over to a scroll saw. You can certainly do this on a bandsaw also, and I just trim off the excess material from the second half of the scales. Really starting to take shape now. So now I'm going to profile the handles and the bolsters. I go right back over to the OBM 2x72 grinder. I put a 90-degree work table on it, and using a coarse grit, I think this is a 60 grit paper, 60 grit belt. I'm just going to profile the handles and the bolsters, get them all matched up to the tang. You can let that belt kind of override one side of the platen, and it will then, instead of having a real sharp grinding edge, it will kind of go to a curvature a little bit. 2x72 grinders is almost indispensable for a knife maker. It just really is the perfect tool. I'm also going to use a small wheel attachment, and this comes with a variety of different size wheels to get into the tight curve up by the bolster. You always want to make sure you run it at a lower RPM with these small wheel attachments, just so the bearings last. The final step, and again, a lot of people don't peen pins on their handles. I do, and I just do a little bit. Especially with wood, you don't want to go too tight because you will split the wood, and you can split the wood very easily. So what I'm really doing is just tapping each side of the pins just so that they swell up a minute amount and fill in whatever little gaps there are between the pin and the size of the drill hole. Let the pin epoxy dry. And then I do a lot of the shaping of the bolsters as well as the handles with an angle grinder and a flap sanding wheel. A lot of people don't. A lot of people will do it on the 2x72. A lot of people do a lot of hand sanding. I'm just showing you the way I do it. I do it with the flap sanding wheel for the bulk of the material and the bulk of the shaping. And then I'll go to an oscillating sander with an 80 grit, then a 220 grit, and then I will hand sand. Usually with a 400 grit, and with the brass I really like to go to 800, at least 800, sometimes a little bit more, but at least 800 before you buff. So this is the finished product. First attempt at Dovetail Bolsters actually worked out easier than I thought it was going to, and I really think that the end result really enhanced this particular blade. I might not do dovetails on all my future chef knives, but I think for the special ones, I'm definitely going to do this again. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I ask that you please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this YouTube channel. I'd like to give you an invite to join us on our Facebook group, Knives and Knife Making. By all means, post images of your own creations or just check out what everybody else is doing. Please check us out on the web at DIYEasyCrafts.com. We have a variety of knife making videos on there. And please keep an eye out for our upcoming book, Introduction to Knife Making. Thank you very much.